Over the course of 2019, there are 5 eclipses destined to occur. And so I'll provide here some insights into eclipses generally, and more specifically, bring emphasis to these 5 eclipses and how they might have an influence in your life this year. First, when I say destined, what I'm referring to is the fact that all events in astrology are already there, set in motion based on the orbital rates of the planets and the very reality of our solar system as it is. It doesn't change a lot, although there are subtle variables and small shifts, etc., that are studied, but these are very, very marginal. And by and large, the planets do have very regular cyclic orbital periods and timing, etc., when they conjunct, which are called conjunction intervals, etc. So there are a lot of, all of the factors in astrology are destined. They're already there. That they have an influence on us here on Earth is a fact. That's what astrology is all about. And just a quick reminder, astrology is not limited by physics. Although physics does play a role, astrology, it should be understood, is based on metaphysics. Metaphysics can also be described or understood as holism. And holism is where we understand that we are conscious beings living in consciousness. That's a basic, good way of describing it. And we are multidimensional beings living in a multidimensional universe. And these other dimensions aren't just intelligent and what you would call objective unto themselves. In other words, if you were in another dimension, it would appear that that is reality now. But there also, it's good to understand that the interdimensional planes are actually very much the building blocks of this outer dimension. And that's an important metaphysical takeaway. Now, over the course of the year here in 2019, as mentioned, there are 5 eclipses. 3 of them are solar. The first already occurred there on January 5th. The next one that's solar is on July the 2nd. And the last one on just after Christmas on Boxing Day there at the end of the year. Now, the first one, the degrees of the eclipses can be metaphorically understood to be like acupuncture points, very specific, very, where they are is very specific, and each point is different than the next point. And the chart always must be looked at as a whole to really understand the deeper story, what's sometimes understood as the gestalt, the whole picture. Always, that must be understood. That's true of your birth chart. That's true of whatever's going on at this time and how it will influence you. Even though horoscopes do provide a good, remarkably good general take on how the influences will unfold in our life according to our sun sign, they shouldn't be understood to be as precise as when you get your natal chart looked at, and specifically in relationship to current cycles. The eclipses, by the way, are linked to transits, and there are other levels and kinds of predictive techniques that should be understood. So 15 degrees Capricorn, 25 minutes is the first one. 10 Cancer, 38 is the second. And for Capricorn again, 07 or 07 minutes is the one that ends the year. So keeping it very simple, if you have planets or angles or even house cusps that are at these approximate degrees, I could say at these precise degrees, but there's a margin of what's called orb of influence, which could be understood to be about 3 degrees either side of the exact, and especially if they're 3 degrees prior, it's rather significant. When it comes to interpreting the influence of events like this, yeah, it's a real fine art. But the main thing to understand is that if you do have planets or angles, which again would be metaphorically related to acupuncture points, you will receive the impulse. What it will do is another story. And again, that's based on the deeper reaches of your destiny. And but it's already there in place from the moment you took your first breath. Always a good understanding. Now, the two lunar eclipses over this period occur, first one here coming up on January 21st, 2019, and the next one on July 16th. The first one at 0 degrees Leo, it catches my attention because 0 degrees is known as a critical degree. It's like the alpha degree, the beginning of something. So it has its own extra added potency for that reason. And by the way, it's also been dubbed as a super wolf blood moon. And there's all this added sensation that comes from astronomy and other various cultural lore traditions when, for example, referring it to as wolf moon. There's nothing standard about that. Even if astronomers have, or mainstream astronomy has dubbed the moons in any given way, making them official, so-called, they're not really. It's more of a lore aspect of astronomy. Many astronomers probably would even frown upon it. If you study any culture in the world that traditionally were very focused on the moons, they each named the full moons differently. Okay, from one culture to the next, even neighboring tribes, they just had their own interpretation. So there's nothing official and final about calling it a wolf moon. However, and also I should say, referring to it as a super moon is again a bit of astronomy sneaking in, although of course traditionally astrology and astronomy were very closely related. In fact, they worked in tandem. Since the scientific revolution, astronomy's kind of gone off on its own direction, and it sort of arrogantly poo-poos astrology because it doesn't, astrology is not strictly and solely based on physics. That's the whole reason, because science in the scientific community, anything metaphysical is anathema to it. It must be proven empirically, and we all have heard the story. It's kind of yada, 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 because, quantum physics has already broken down all those walls. So it's funny and interesting that there's a lot of catching up going on in society in various academic or, fields of academic circles or fields of study that just, hard kind of dogmas die hard, you could say. Now, the main point then is these degree points, again, same principle. If they're at the same, if you have planets or angles at approximately these degrees, and especially if they're exact. Exact is exact. It's like bullseye, So if you're playing darts and you got the dart on the board, well, you're in the game. If you get bullseye, well, that's the big score. That's the big hit. So if you have a planet or degree at one of these degrees this year, it'll be bullseye. And the effect is stronger, obviously, for that very reason. So it's not a question of whether it's a wolf moon or it's a super moon, etc. Those aren't astrology doesn't defer to that. It's just not a part of it. Again, that's a bit of sort of physics. Even the moon, when it's closer, can sometimes be subject to an optical illusion. The wolf moon is lore. So astrology, being based on metaphysics, looks at it much differently. It's much more a case of exactitude to the points, the degrees. So that's where physics does, or mathematics does, enter the picture, certainly. But just basically understand that the generic perspective on a supermoon and a wolf moon, not that important. But if you have a planet or angle at that degree, now it's important. Then it becomes super, all right. It's a big impulse. It can go in any direction. It could be very positive. It could activate changes that you've been hoping and waiting for. It could go negative. It could activate changes that are difficult and, part of the harder parts of destiny. Could be somewhere in between. So it's really, you cannot generically say. It's not a sign-based thing, except that in horoscopes, admittedly, the moon, the degrees will land in a solar house. I say solar because in horoscopes, the houses are deemed generally equal and they parallel the signs. Signs and houses are equal in a solar chart, again, which is what's used to cast horoscopes. So we can, just based on your sun sign, say that these eclipses will land in a certain sign / house, and that will have a wide angle effect. And that's very, again, interesting. Even that it works, that horoscopes work, and they do, it already defies the laws of physics in terms of how it would assume it would work. It just does not make any sense to a physicist because it's just a different paradigm altogether. Now, the influence of a solar eclipse is much more powerful in the long term, especially. A lunar eclipse can have a strong effect in the shorter term, for sure, but it's not and it's not as deep, you might say. It's sort of shallower. A solar eclipse represents the beginning of a long cycle, so it's hard to make a clear metaphor, but it could be described like a lunar eclipse, when the moon's full, it'd be like fireworks. It's fairly big, fairly impressive. There can be some big booms and sounds. If it's a solar eclipse and it's very, in effect, generally, it's like an underground explosion. It's like a TNT of a much larger magnitude. But it could be occurring somewhere far away, so it doesn't mean anything to you. So solar eclipse can come, and although they're more powerful if they land on very sensitive points in your chart, they're not as impressive and immediately obvious as the lunar eclipse. So it's just a way of understanding it, and these sorts of distinctions are an important part of astrology. Now, the effect of a solar eclipse can last years, where it's generally understood that the effect of a lunar eclipse can last up to months, which is a lot, but not years. And the degree of the solar eclipse is, again, important. And when planets, especially major planets, make hard aspects to those points over the coming months and even up to years, they can have reverberations, like aftershock, after tremor of a major earthquake kind of principle. So they get reactivated, and it depends on which planets are doing it, and it also depends on the whole picture, as I keep saying. On that note, so let me illustrate the whole picture. Many of you looking at this chart, it's new, you're not familiar, it's not easy for you to just jump in there and start understanding what you're seeing. It's understandable. But what I do want to show you is, for example, here there's the new moon with sun and moon. Saturn and Pluto were close. And there's the south node. And eclipses, by the way, occur when the sun-moon conjunction or the full moon occurs close to one of these nodes. That's the south node, and this is the north node. So the eclipse is either understood as a south node eclipse or a north node eclipse, by the way. And it's not a given whether it's the solar is not just south and lunar north. It doesn't work like that. They can reverse. The main thing is that you have to look at the chart really if you really want to understand that eclipse. Although the exact degree of 1524 Capricorn, for example, is the needle on the point, the rest of the chart also does factor in. It's less immediate, but it's a part of the entire arena. It's all the whole picture. Now, I've said that a few times. You can't say that enough in astrology. But it does get to a point where it can, get complicated to really understand, but that's the job of an astrologer, to intuitively weigh how the whole chart is occurring. So, for example, if I were to take this chart and overlay it for the eclipse on your chart, I would see the specific planets, let's say like Mars down here in Aries, which is moving fairly quickly, over the days and weeks. I would say, is Mars also very strongly aspecting a planet in your chart? And if by conjunction or some other hard aspect, if it is, it's going to play a role. So that should basically make it clear. It's almost like a game, a sport game where you're following, let's say, the ball or the puck or something. But there's other activities going on in the corner. The camera's not focusing on that, but it's happening, and it's all a part of the bigger play. So that's a nice basic way of understanding that. So that's all I wanted to say for now. There's more. I'll bring more attention to these things in other videos, so just keep watching for these. These specifically are for the year of 2019, but as you might tell, there's some longer term takeaways here. So keep that in mind, and thanks for your time, and I'll see you next time.